Hello. At this station, we're going to take an in-depth look at the water quality of Terrell Creek to determine how healthy it is for the salmon species living here. Earlier in our habitat assessment, we looked at many different factors that could affect salmon, from human impacts like roads and cars, to animals and trees, and even moving water. Now we're going to zoom in and focus on how those three C's help salmon. Do you remember what those three C's are? That's right, cold, clean, and clear. And at this station, we're going to be doing some experiments to test how cold, clean, and clear the water is. And we will record our results so that we can share our findings with other scientists and track changes over time. First, we're going to test how cold the water is by taking its temperature. Salmon need water that is cold, or their young and eggs won't survive, and there won't be enough oxygen in the water for them to breathe. Salmon can tolerate temperatures that are under 20 degrees Celsius. They prefer temperatures that are 5 to 13 degrees Celsius, but they can tolerate 14 to 20. And they can't survive in temperature that is warmer than 20 degrees Celsius. They're not like us. They can't take off a layer or put on a coat. And they need cold water to be able to breathe and to survive. So how do we measure how cold the water is? Do you know what tool we might be using today? You may have guessed it. We are using a thermometer to test how cold the water of Terrell Creek is. First, we need to get our water sample from Terrell Creek, which we have in this container. And next, we'll put these thermometers in so they can test how cold it is. Now that the thermometers have settled to the water temperature, it's time to look at our results. So if you take a look at our thermometer, it looks like we have about 14 degrees Celsius. Let's double check with the other one. And yep, we're right around 14 degrees Celsius. While I write that down, take some time to decide if you think that is excellent, fair, or poor for salmon. I think a temperature of 14 degrees Celsius is fair. Our next test is turbidity, and turbidity is a measure of how clear the water is. If you were a salmon, which of these samples would you want to swim in? Would you want to swim in the top, the middle, or the bottom? If you chose the top sample, or low turbidity, you would be a happy, healthy salmon. Salmon like water that is low in turbidity or relatively clear, because high turbidity, which oftentimes happens after rain events, can wash soil and other materials into the water and make it very hard for salmon to be able to see and make it difficult for them to find their food or to avoid predators. So salmon like water that is relatively clear or low turbidity. But how do we actually measure how much dirt is in the water? We use a tool called a turbidity tube. Salmon prefer turbidity that is less than 10 on a turbidity scale. Each of these measurements represents a number called NTUs. They can survive in anything that is 30 or less. Anything above 30 NTUs, and it's much more difficult for salmon to survive. We took this turbidity tube and filled it with water from Terrell Creek, and now we can look into it and measure the turbidity. Take a look into this tube and look at the bottom. Can you see the symbol that's at the bottom? It looks like we can see the symbol at the bottom of the tube, which means the turbidity level is 0. So while I record that, take some time to decide if you think that is excellent, fair, or poor for salmon. I think a turbidity rating of 0 is excellent for salmon. Our third test is dissolved oxygen. What do salmon use to breathe oxygen? That's right, they use their gills. And the oxygen that salmon are breathing is not in the air, like the oxygen that we breathe, but is underwater. This is measured in parts per million. Parts per million can be seen like a fraction. If you have 1 million parts of water, we're trying to determine how many are oxygen. Or another way to think of it is, if I have 1 million red Skittles and I take 10 red Skittles out and replace them with 10 purple Skittles, we have 10 parts per million of purple Skittles. Salmon need oxygen that is at least 9 parts per million to be able to thrive. And this is usually mixed into the water via waves or current or the wind. The way that we measure how many parts per million are in Terrell Creek is by doing a chemistry experiment. So I'm going to put on some safety equipment, goggles, and gloves, and we'll get started with our dissolved oxygen experiment. First, we collected our sample. Next, we're going to add 2 chemicals. We call them chemical 1 and chemical 2, but their real names are manganese sulfate and lithium hydroxide monohydrate. That's a mouthful. The sulfates in chemical 1 help clean the sample, while chemical 2 changes the color to show us that there's oxygen in there. Now that these are added, it's time to shake it. Whoa, look at that. It looks like we made lemonade that has a lot of pulp in it. I don't think it would taste very good though. Let's let all of that pulp settle. Now that that's settled, we can add our next chemical. Can you guess what we call it? You may have figured it out. It's chemical 3, also known as sulfamic acid. This will get our sample's oxygen ready to be measured and will change the appearance of our sample. Let's shake it up and take a look. Wow, look at that. It definitely changed. So to me, it looks like we turned our pulpy lemonade into apple juice. I still don't think it will taste very good though. Now we need to collect 1 million parts of water, which we will do using this small sample container. The last step in our experiment is called a titration and involves our last chemical. Can you guess what it is? Oh, I may have fooled you this time because we call this one sodium thiosulfate, which is what it's actually called. We're going to add 1 drop at a time to this sample and shake it after each drop. Your job is to decide how many drops it takes for the sample to turn clear. There's 1. The number of drops until it takes to be clear is how many parts per million of dissolved oxygen are present. Have you seen a change yet? We're at 5, 6. That looks pretty clear to me. It looks like the water here has 6 parts per million of dissolved oxygen. While I record that, take some time to decide if you think that is excellent, fair, or poor for salmon. I think a dissolved oxygen rating of 6 is poor for salmon. While they can survive in above 6, they need at least 9 parts per million in order to thrive. So now that we have tested Terrell Creek for temperature, turbidity, and dissolved oxygen, it's time to make a conclusion. Based on the 3 tests and the results from those, what do you think is the overall health of Terrell Creek based on the water quality? Do you think it is excellent, fair, or poor? Take some time to think of a conclusion for yourself. I think based on those 3 results, the water quality of Terrell Creek is fair. While we had an excellent turbidity, we only had fair temperature and we had a poor dissolved oxygen rating, giving us an overall rating of fair for Terrell Creek. Thanks for joining me today at the Water Quality Station.